Accidental whistleblower exposes Five Eyes, and is the New York Times now anti-Semitic too? Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 23rd of May 2024. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robert Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Lisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be talking about how Daniel Duggan, we talked about before on the show, was asked to spy for the Americans and how that has now blown back on them in a dramatic way. Sort of a different aspect of the story that we usually discuss. And then we're going to talk about a New York Times Magazine article on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which gives a completely different perspective to the usual mainstream media reports and blows up the narrative.
Especially, it's unprecedented for American mainstream media to report what the New York Times has done. And of course, the Daniel Duggan revelations could put a completely different complexion on that case than we've known until now. And it's going to be part of a hearing tomorrow.
Yes. Now, before we get into it, please subscribe if you haven't already, ring the notification bell and you'll be alerted to new content as it comes up. And we're expecting more in the period to come. Please comment, share as widely as you can, hit the like button, that all helps to get the message circulating. And if you can, please donate to the cause to keep our operation running, to keep exposing these important issues and mobilising for the solutions even more importantly. So you can find a link in the information box below if you're watching this on YouTube. Otherwise, you can call us on our toll-free number, which will be on the screen at various points throughout the show. Now, before we get into the first topic, last week you promised a report that we would tell our viewers who have been crucial to this campaign that the inquiry, the parliamentary inquiry into regional bank branch closures, which has been, they've had 13 hearings in 13 months, and we were all awaiting the final report last Thursday. What happened?
Well, they delayed it. So I apologise. I've got two things to apologise for. First, I'm a bit under the weather today, so bear with me. Hopefully I'll recover soon. Second, they delayed the report until, frustratingly, tomorrow. So they went from, it's supposed to be
still can't tell you.
Thursday the 16th last week and now it's tomorrow, Friday the 24th. So we don't know what's in it, but we will find out. So as I said last week, stay tuned. We'll have something circulating probably as early as Monday on the contents of this report. We do know some things have fallen off the back of a bus, of a truck, the proverbial truck. One is, according to one rumour, we'll put it that way, is it's a very large report, 150 pages. And I'm not surprised. It was a significant, major inquiry. Very comprehensive, and the report has to reflect that. But we will see what's in it, and we'll see where it goes on the question of a public bank, a post office people's bank that we pushed as the solution. And I'm pretty confident that it will trigger a lot of debate about that, at least, even if the report itself doesn't recommend it. We will be leading that debate, Elisa, as we have. So what's this space? The other thing we're looking for, though, is just a simple principle. If the report diagnoses the problem as cancer, but only prescribes a Band-Aid, we will know and we will tell you. And that will be not good enough. I actually think this kind of process, these Senate inquiries, is the best part of how our Parliament works. The people we elect have to go onto the coalface, meet real people, get real feedback, and that's why we encourage everyone to participate in these things, right? Because it makes them better parliamentarians when they do that.
Yes.
But there's hidden, mostly, vested interests that are working behind the scenes all the time to keep their control over their corporate control over the body politic. And so that process runs up against these vested interests. And that's why you can have a really good inquiry and then the report doesn't match it. But it's how you smoke out those vested interests and identify what they are, right? Nothing is wasted. This is not a wasted exercise. So watch this space, we'll keep you posted.
Yeah, it's a tug of war for sure. And we'll be putting out an email, a media release. If you don't get our media releases, go to our website and you can join our email list. And that way you'll be kept informed of things like that in between the videos. Now, our first topic, accidental whistleblower exposes Five Eyes. So, yes, this is the story, as we mentioned, of Daniel Duggan, an American Top Gun pilot who went on to...
His business was a joy flight business in Tasmania and a business in Australia. He did some work for a flight training centre in South Africa because he's a skillful guy, and so that helped supplement his income running his business in Australia. And because his business in Australia was so successful, he met his wife, they're married and they've got children. He also became an Australian citizen. So everything that's happened to Dan Duggan is as an Australian citizen.
Yeah, but it was while he was in South Africa, right, that he was accused by the US government.
For what he was doing in South Africa.
Of training.
He's been accused of training the Chinese military. It's called the US Arms Control Act.
Yeah.
So he's basically been accused of giving American military secrets to the Chinese because he trained Chinese military pilots. That's what the allegation is. He insists, and the South African training school insists, no, we trained civilian pilots, right? And I'll give you some more on that. But that's the essence of it.
So because he breached the US Arms Export Control Act, allegedly in this claim, that still, however, that doesn't exist in Australia. So it's not a breach of Australian law, and therefore the attempt to extradite him fails the first condition, which requires that it would be a breach of both of the laws of both countries.
This is the part that there's a lot to do with this case that's murky, and we're going to raise the big new revelation that's really murky. But the part that's crystal clear, there's the parts that are crystal clear that Australians should be up in arms about are simply this. One is what he's accused of doing was in 2011. He's arrested in 2022 for something he did 11 years earlier. And the assumption was, he's training the enemy, except China, by 2022, everyone was calling China the enemy. No one in 2011 was calling China the enemy. In fact, in 2014, late 2014, the Chinese president addressed our parliament at the invitation of none other than Tony Abbott and the Liberal government, right? That's how Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister in June 2019, said, we welcome Belt and Road and the positive contribution it can make to the region. June 2019, he said that, right? We had Chinese military ships invited to dock in Australia in 2019 on their way back from work they were doing as part of an international coalition in North Africa to help police the pirates over there, right? So this whole China enemy stuff was not the case. So that's one thing that's black and white. There's like a rewriting of history. They're retroactively trying to fit the current hysteria about China into what he was doing in 2011. And the second part that's even more black and white is this. When you extradite somebody, there's an extradition treaty that governs how those decisions are made, and Julian Assange is at the moment going through the same thing in the UK. The extradition treaty Australia has with the United States is crystal clear. The crime for which we agree the United States can extradite someone from Australia must be also a crime in Australia. It's called dual criminality. And there's nothing about what they're accusing Dan Duggan of that meets the threshold of dual criminality. It's black and white, clear cut. No, it doesn't. So the fact the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus approved this arrest back in October 2022, knowing it didn't meet the requirement, but obviously with an intention to make it fit, which is what Dan Duggan will deal with tomorrow in court. By the time you're watching this, it'll be like we release the show on Friday night. It'll be in the morning. It'll have happened, so you'll see something on the news. You'll know more than we do right now. He clearly did that with an intention to do a fix-up job for the Americans and make it fit. Australians should be very angry about that.
So, you know, all this time, well, for the last 18 months, Dan Duggan's been sitting in horrific conditions in solitary confinement, 18 months, and he can't even access a computer that's not even on the internet. I mean, he has to be shackled and in orange Guantanamo Bay style jumpsuit wherever he goes. You know, he's the only guy in that prison who hasn't been charged with some horrific offence.
He's the only one who hasn't been convicted. It's a maximum correction prison, maximum security prison. He's the only one not convicted. So there's murderers, there's rapists, there's terrorists, all convicted in that prison. He's on remand, right?
Yeah.
For at worst a white collar thing anyway, and he does not have any of the rights the rest of the prison. He's kept in solitary, can't use a computer. Every other prisoner has access to a computer. He doesn't have access to a computer, not even one not connected to the internet.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Now, there's 3 things you can look at for more info, but we'll go through some of the details. We put out a media release on this case, on the revelations in this case, on Tuesday. You can see that on our website. Robbie, you did an interview with Daniel Dumbrell
On
his channel
I
on YouTube.
foreshadowed that last week, so we'll put the link to that below.
Yeah, that's really, you can go and watch that full interview for all the details and a discussion that, you know, examines all the different issues involved.
Well, that interview actually, I'm a little bit proud of this, Elisa. For the first time I know for sure we broke a story last week, and that was because I got access to this letter that Dan Duggan wrote from prison the week before.
Yeah.
And so I broke the news to the world on that show last week. So you can watch that. We're going to cover the same thing now, but that was the breaking news last week.
And you can, if you want to read it in black and white, there's an excellent article by Mary Kostakidis, former SBS journalist, at Pearls and Irritations, and we can put up a link for that too.
And I must say, look, because her name's come up, huge shout out to Mary Kostakidis. There are real journalists in the world.
Yes.
So for those Australians of a certain generation, if you remember a time when television was free to air and there's only 5 channels, and SBS was the exotic one.
One that gave you a bit more background and detail.
And the news, SBS News was very comprehensive about global news. You'd remember Mary Kostakidis on our news screens every night from that time. Mary Kostakidis is somebody who, as the world has got worse, she did not sell out like so many other journalists and just go along to keep protecting the system as it got worse. She's a huge critic of it. She's a huge champion for Julian Assange, and does a brilliant job in fighting very hard using her journalistic skills for the truth. So her article on Dan Duggan is excellent.
Yeah. Now let's go through a few of the points. So this claim that Dan Duggan trained military pilots, he of course refutes that. He only trained civilian pilots, and he only used open source material. So the claim that he gave away secrets about American military operating procedures and so forth to the Chinese
Tactics,
you know, is all a ruse. It's not true, and there's various things that give this away. I mean, one of his alleged conspirators in training these Chinese military pilots and sharing American secrets was supposedly a low-level mechanic, but there was another guy there working in South Africa who was a much more senior employee and whom Dan Duggan actually believed was spying for the British, who wasn't named as one of the conspirators. So there's things like that already were giving away.
So these people are named in the indictment as conspirators, but none of them indicted themselves, right? Only of all the people involved in this South African test flight academy, only Dan Duggan has been indicted. So yeah, these are the giveaways, and he does say, look, this guy, he was pretty convinced this guy was an informer to British intelligence, and yeah, nothing's been done to him. So there's a whole setup factor here. But the more interesting thing is how Dan Duggan, why is Dan Duggan the only one?
Yes.
And we'll get to that.
Before we get to that, though, I just wanted to raise the other issue, which came up on the 60 Minutes
Yes.
show.
So this is quite revealing. So according to Dan Duggan and according to everyone he worked with over in the South African Test Flight Academy, it's a test flight academy. They're training pilots, and let me preface it by saying one of the things that people need to understand, especially about Chinese pilots, and why China and why Chinese pilots are getting trained around the world, is because China's living standards have risen so fast that the per capita income of the Chinese has soared, and they can actually afford. They used to be the poorest people in the world, right? They can afford all these things now. So the airline industry in China is growing at a rate of knots. It's actually unbelievable, and the demand for trained pilots is enormous. So there was even a case, I locked horns with Barnaby Joyce a few years ago, I think around 2019, because Virgin Australia had done a deal with a Chinese company to train Chinese pilots in Tamworth, at an airfield in Tamworth. And because Barnaby Joyce is an arch sinophobe, and one of these guys totally stuck in this McCarthyite mindset, anything from China is sus, right? Oh, the Chinese are invading us, right? It was just a business, but why in Australia? Oh, why in Australia? Because they need as much, the demand is so great, they're exporting the training all around, sort of sourcing the training all around the world to do it. So anyway, there's nothing actually suspicious about what Daniel Duggan was doing in South Africa. But on 60 Minutes, and we'll play this clip, and we'll actually put a link to the whole 60 Minutes episode. People should watch it, because I was worried it was going to be a stitch-up, and it wasn't. And I think the journalist, once she saw the whole story and met the family, etc., was quite moved by the circumstance. But this was quite revealing, because she interviews an American official who makes it clear that America regards civilian pilots in China as military anyway.
Yeah.
That's America's view, and it's called civil-military fusion, and they claim it's a Chinese doctrine, so that there's no distinction between civilian pilots and military pilots. This is what America's projecting on this case. So have a look at the clip.
Daniel says he only ever taught civilian pilots from China. But the US claims they were in fact Chinese military aviators. Dr. Edel says it's often difficult to separate the two.
The Chinese have introduced a concept that they call civil-military fusion and how they go about acquiring technology, but it basically lays out the case that there is no distinction between civilian and military application and use. There is no bright shining line between those who are trained in the civilian arena and those who have the ability to actualize things from a military perspective when you're dealing with the Chinese state.
So back in 2012, would there have been a big difference between a civilian pilot and a military pilot? Would that have been more clear-cut?
I think even in 2012, there were concerns about the Chinese military.
And that's that sort of view, Elisa. How can you win?
Yeah.
Right? So here's Daniel Duggan, was a Top Gun for 12 years. He knows the rules. 60 Minutes makes it clear. He knew that if he was training Chinese military pilots, he needed permission. But he wasn't training Chinese military pilots. He didn't know that 11 years after the fact, his actions will be reinterpreted according to this American view, which, by the way, America published what that guy just said in 2017. They decided in 2017 that they were going to demonise everything civilian in China as military, and I'll find the link and we can put this image up on the website here. It's the US State Department, I think. It's its own, or Defense Department. It's its own page on this accusation of a civil military fusion doctrine in China. And Daniel Duggan didn't know that in 2011, right? That they were going to do that. But now they get to do that and demonise everything he did.
But this idea of this civil military fusion, this is something that the Americans and the British do, as you said, themselves. It's embedded in the new security doctrines that came out from about 2017. But the British, it came up in 2015 when they put out their National Security Capability Review, and they referenced just briefly this so-called fusion doctrine of a collective approach to national security, and then it was elaborated more in subsequent documents coming through through until the 2020s. And there's a diagram here that I've grabbed out of one of their documents where they talk about how national security has to be the responsibility not just of the national security related government agencies, defence and homeland security or whatever you want to call it, but it has to be the responsibility and in the thinking of every single government department, and that they also would recruit third parties to, basically keep an eye on security for them, and the private sector, and recruit various agencies across the entire economy. And there were economic aspects as well as security aspects and influence operations that they would boil down into this whole fusion doctrine.
So think about this. So in 2015, the British announced a fusion doctrine to justify them drawing all civilian activities up under the military umbrella. It wasn't until 2017 that the Americans accused China of doing that. So, and we see this all the time. The Americans and the British accuse the Chinese of doing what they're actually doing.
Yeah.
Right? So for instance, why do they demonise Belt and Road? Because if they could ever have that kind of influence and engagement with all the countries in the world, 140 countries in the world that China does with Belt and Road, they would be debt traps and plunder those countries to death. That's why they would do it. They would do it so they get a foothold and let. Because why do we know that? Because that's what they've done for 70 years. That's exactly what they've done, using the IMF and the World Bank to get these countries in debt and say, okay, now our companies go in there, our banks go in there, our mining's, you've got to privatise everything, these things, etc. They've plundered them to death. And because China's not doing that, but because they would do that, that's what they're accusing China of doing.
They can't understand any other way of looking at the world, frankly, so they impose that on China and say, well, they must be thinking that way.
And let me make another point. The fusion thing we have here in Australia. I want the viewer to think about this. Every time you hear the government talk about manufacturing now, what are they talking about? Weapons. Apart from this stupid solar panel thing that Albo's got going, and we'll use that for weapons as well. The whole manufacturing base of Australia that they're talking up, it's all about weapons manufacturing. And he signed a deal with Biden under Biden's Inflation Reduction Act that now gives over control to Biden of Australia's whole industrial base, including mining, because it can be used, it must be used for America's military industrial complex. We've sold our soul to be part of this thing. So that's what we do. And they're using this accusation against China to say, oh, that's why we can say that civilian pilots, we're going to consider them military pilots.
But the Anglo-American effort to use an innocent person, even unbeknownst really to him what he was being asked to do, Dan Duggan, to basically spy for them, are blowing back on this whole apparatus that you've just described, on the whole operation. So we want to go now into those details because Dan Duggan was approached in late 2012, early 2013, after returning to Australia from South Africa, by ASIO, who made contact with him initially about him renewing his aviation security ID card, because of course there's all these security things that are imposed on people these days. So ASIO requested a meeting with him, and when they showed up, there were not only two ASIO officers there, which he was surprised about, but also a US intelligence officer as well. So what they proposed is that he basically spy for them, that he gather information while he conducted business, which he was planning to conduct business in China.
The proposal was fairly vaguely worded, but they made it clear that they were interested in what he was doing in China, and so he interpreted that as they wanted him to inform for them.
Because he even went out of his way to say there was some concern that he picked up on about his operations in South Africa and or China, and he offered to not operate out of those two locations.
That's what they started. They made it clear they knew everything he'd done in South Africa, and they knew that he had plans to start a business in China, which was, by the way, an airline consultancy business in China, doing consulting to this burgeoning airline industry. Now, what's particularly relevant about that to what he's going to deal with tomorrow is when he was indicted years later by the US government, the indictment has 4 charges that only relate to what he did in South Africa, but then the rest of the indictment is filled with all this description about what he did in China in order, as if, even though it's not relevant to the indictment, but in order to smear his activities in China as if that somehow makes him suspicious. Yet, in his meeting with these intelligence officers, they knew all about both places and they had no problem with what he did in both places.
They encouraged it and they said, well, look, you know, if you come across, meet any generals from
we'll do business.
Chinese, you know, the PLA, let us know, you know.
Yeah, that's what they said. Let us know, we'll do business. He was really struck by that's in his letter. He wrote this letter about this a couple of weeks ago. Let us know, we'll do business. And they made it clear, because he, as you said, he'd offered, I can cut off contact you. He was actually taken aback. Here's these intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
And he thinks, okay, if there's something untoward about these activities, let me know, I'll stop it.
Well, he's a military guy.
Yeah,
so
he's used to taking orders.
Yeah.
And no. They said, no, we want you to do business in China. We want you to do business in China. And that was the reason why. If you meet any generals, let us know, we'll do business.
But another curious thing at that meeting was that they presented him with a document that they wanted him to sign.
Yep.
And then when he asked to have his lawyers look at it, they quickly
it.
grabbed it and said, no, don't worry about it. And then that actually came up at a future meeting where he, when he subsequently met with these same intelligence people, he asked for the document. He said, give me the document you showed me before. I'm happy to sign that. And they said, no, that's not an issue. Don't worry about it. But he was given advice like things like when you go to China, you know, if you've got us in your phone, just make sure you don't identify us as being with ASIO.
Don't say Joe Blogs ASIO. take the ASIO out of the name. Right.
So, you know, it was clear
you're going to be under surveillance.
That, you know, he was going to be basically, you know, spying for the Anglo-Americans and Australians.
Well, I want to characterise it this way because essentially, yes, he agreed to cooperate with them. And on paper, there's no conclusion, there's no other conclusion to draw that meant informing for them, providing information they wanted that would, by any country, would construe as spying. Spying is a broad definition. Now, why would he? Now, I would never have done that in 2012, right? But he's only just become an Australian citizen at this point. 12 years in the military. This is a guy who I suspect he thinks very differently now that he's seen the real face of his government. But this is a guy who's thinking, well, my superiors in the military apparatus that I've been part of are asking me to do something. There must be some important reason for it, so I better do it. All his troubles seem to stem from what happened as a result of making that decision. Yeah,
so he was advised by the intelligence agents that when he was in China, not to communicate with them, but to go via an intermediary at the consulate in China. And nothing much happened. I mean, it seems to be the case that he didn't really do much spying effectively. He went about his business, but at a certain point in 2014, his Chinese business agent who was travelling was arrested in Canada, which the Chinese were apparently suspicious about his involvement with this fellow, and Dan Duggan was then detained in China.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would characterise it, he doesn't admit to having done anything for them in China because the intelligence agencies later got upset that he hadn't contacted them, but he was expecting them to contact him.
Yeah.
So he had agreed to be cooperative, but he didn't actually follow through on it because he assumed that because they'd given him this lecture about he'd be under surveillance in China, he assumed that they would find a way to contact him that would be safe, and that wasn't forthcoming. And next thing you know, they're acting all paranoid about as a result. And his connection to this person who was arrested in Canada was simply that this man ran a very large labour hire firm that was associated with the airline industry, and he knew this guy because he needed to source parts for his plane that he used in his business in Tasmania, his Joy Flight business, that were hard to get. So this guy, his contact, this businessman, Chinese businessman, sourced them for him. There's not a military aspect to this, right? So that's how he knew him. The Canadians arrested that man. Dan Duggan didn't come under suspicion by the Chinese because of his connection to the businessman. The Chinese had to verify that Dan Duggan had nothing to do with the American agencies and the Canadian agencies arresting him. They thought he might be. He came under suspicion because they thought he might be connected to that, and so they took away his passport. And for the next 7 years, he wasn't allowed to leave the country. He was able to continue his business. He carried on with his business, but until they were satisfied that he wasn't associated with that, they didn't let him leave the country. And this upset him greatly, and he got more mad at the Americans and the Canadians than he did at the Chinese, because he said they would have known that the arrest of that man in Canada, that businessman in Canada, on a very minor thing anyway, they would have known that would have put him in danger in China, and they went ahead and did it anyway. And before we go on, I just want to make a general point, because Australians have been bombarded for a long time now with these stories about Australians arrested, Australian citizens or whatever, arrested in China who are perfectly innocent and they get accused of espionage. And there's one there now. And then the Canadians got the same thing. There were these two businessmen, both named Michael, the two Michaels. They got arrested, and our government say they're absolutely innocent. But then when the Michaels got finally released, then the Canadian government actually compensated them because they were set up, because they were made to be spies over there. And what these agencies do, they will set people up to be spies and then leave them to carry the bag and carry the consequences of that. So Dan Duggan was very unhappy with that.
Yeah. Because there was other curious activity when he returned to Australia after he got out of China. So he came back to Australia in 2022 and he had a meeting with ASIO. But it was a very brief meeting, and they said, we'll have a longer meeting at a future point. But then they never contacted him, and Duggan couldn't contact them. He couldn't reach them. Then he received an adverse assessment on his security clearance, and his security clearance was recalled.
Which he'd never had in his whole career.
And what's more, he got a formal letter to that effect signed by the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, which then afterwards he had a brief contact from ASIO who thought that was very odd, why the top level guy would be signing this document, and just told him to reapply for his clearance, that it should go through if he reapplied. Something might have gone wrong the first time. But then he heard nothing else from them again, radio silence, until he was arrested.
And the chronology here is important, Elisa, because 5 years before what you just said happened, 2017, there's a new government in America, and Donald Trump's the president, but more importantly, Mike Pompeo is the head of the CIA, and then Mike Pompeo became the Secretary of State. Mike Pompeo would personally like nothing more than to start a war with China that blows up into World War III and every Australian die, so that he can and his mate Scott Morrison can be raptured and go to heaven and get away from Armageddon. He's an absolute fruitcake. He's one of the most evil men in the world right now. He is the guy more than anyone else in the Trump administration that took it down this vicious anti-China path that we've all had to go along with. So that's what's happened in America, and that government indicts Dan Duggan because what we described earlier had happened, and the relationship, such as it was, his agreement to cooperate with the intelligence agencies had completely broken down. He was angry at him, it was a total breakdown of the relationship. So they indicted him, and that indictment is the question was that we posed earlier: why, of all the people associated with the training academy in South Africa, only Dan Duggan's been indicted? Because only he was the guy set up by these intelligence agencies, and the whole thing broke down. But he's not back to Australia for 7 years. And so he gets back in September 2022. He's finally let out of China and he gets back he comes back straight away. In September 2022, He's arrested on the 18th of October 2022, and he's been in with those things you just said happening in between, and he's been in solitary confinement ever since.
Yeah, and the thing is, with all that mapped out, and he's obviously putting this together now because he's just kind of walked through the minefield not knowing what was there. There's no way they're going to let this guy off if they can help it, because like with the case of David McBride, which we covered last week, they've got to make an example of him. They've got to throw, these people like him, like Assange, under the bus.
And one of the reasons all this intelligence background has come out now, not at the beginning of the 18-month period, but now, is because his case was looked at by the woman who is the oversight of the intelligence agencies. Her position is the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security. So they appealed to them complaining about ASIO's treatment of him. So that's gone through the process. She's produced a report where she's dismissed a bunch of the things he claimed, but she's upheld a couple. We won't know the details, but we know that she's upheld a couple of the claims of improper behaviour by ASIO. In response to that, and he probably told her office verbally a lot of this. In response to that, Dan Duggan decided, I'm going to put this down on paper. He had to handwrite a lengthy letter because he can't use a computer, and now I and some journalists have seen it, and that's why it's being reported. He had to handwrite this thing out. His team typed it up. So all that is relevant to what's going to happen tomorrow in the Downing Centre, where a magistrate, the same magistrate who refused him legal aid, and said he refused him legal aid after they appealed the fact that the Americans had frozen his wife's property, which is worth $4.2 million, on the grounds of proceeds of crime, even though he only earned $180,000 in what he did in South Africa. So there's no way that money, $180,000, explains a $4.2 million property. The property bubble explains why it's $4.2 million, but it would have been enough to fund his defence. They froze that. This same judge upheld that decision to freeze it, refused him legal aid, and said, and when he was asked, well, how's he supposed to defend himself? This judge said, well, he's a smart guy. He can literally defend himself in court without representation. And the family is now appealing. So when you look at my video, you'll see the link to their appeal. And
we'll put that below as well.
Yeah, exactly. But I want to come back to the main thing I said at the beginning. Despite all that picture, and as you'll see, it's a bit murky, some of it. The bottom line is we have an extradition treaty with the United States, which says dual criminality, and nothing they're accusing him of is a crime in Australia. This is our government fitting up this guy on behalf of the Americans. Like with everything else, we don't have any sovereignty anymore.
And the fight is the same as the fight, the reason we're fighting for Julian Assange and for David McBride, because the fight, it's not about them per se, it's about all of us having access to truth and actual freedom. And so I want to just, to tie off this topic, mention, of course, the good news that earlier this week, in the hearing, the extradition hearing at the London court, Julian Assange the court did rule that Julian Assange can appeal
a full appeal
extradition
to the High Court.
So that is good news, but
it's good news, except Nils, I think Melsner, the rapporteur on torture, and our friend John Jiggins has just written a piece on this, I noticed. He's still stuck in prison to go through these judicial processes, and it's its own form of torture.
Absolutely.
And I mentioned last week when I sat there for more than 2 hours in the court with David McBride, and that judge read out the entire judgment, lasted 2 hours. That felt like torture, right?
Yeah.
And that was just 2 hours for me.
Well, look, I want to play this clip because I just saw it come up from Yanis Varoufakis. He had just caught up with Julian in prison, and you can't but have a tear come to your eye when you see what the poor guy's going through, and that's why we need to get him out now. So watch that clip.
I visited Julian the other day at Belmarsh prison for the second time, Britain's Guantanamo. He spends 23 hours every day for 3.5 years in solitary confinement. This is an attempt not to break him, but to kill him. It's slow murder of a man who's not been convicted, has not been charged of anything except journalism. I find it astonishing that there were people on the left who turned against Julian, newspapers like Guardian, who played a role in his incarceration and vilification. Julian is holding on. Julian is not well. Julian's soul has been diminished by solitary. It feels, he told me, as if his personhood has been shrunk down to a tiny kernel. And his hope is that if our campaign for him to become free again succeeds, that he can grow his personality again from that kernel. This is our duty. If you care for your right to know what your governments do behind your back, in your name, all those crimes against humanity being perpetrated not only in battlefields and invasions of foreign lands, but also against our environment, the secret deals with fossil fuel companies, then you must support Julian Assange, because Julian Assange is dying for your right to know what your government is doing on your behalf behind your back.
Yep.
All right, so do what you can. As I say, the websites are there. There's lots of ways you can help in these campaigns. Now, on to our second but related topic in terms of war and the truth that needs to come out to prevent more future wars and potentially world war in the coming up, whether it be from Ukraine or the Gaza situation. Is the New York Times now anti-Semitic too, is our headline. And this refers to a 16,000 plus word article from the New York Times Magazine, which came out on the 18th of May by Ronan Bergman and Mark Mazzetti. But this is stunning in the sense that it comes from not just the mainstream media, but the New York Times, and completely blows up the narrative maintained by Israel and its allies that the current conflict occurring right now between Israel and Palestine started with the 7th October Hamas attack. Nothing preceded it.
There was no history before 7th of October.
So it's a 3-part bombshell story that shows the decades of legal double standards between the way Israelis and Palestinians have been treated. It shows systematic persecution, torture and murder of Palestinian suspects of terrorism and so forth, while a soft touch for Israeli extremists and proven terrorists.
And actual terrorists, yep.
The title, as we'll put up on the screen, is The Unpunished, How Extremists Took Over Israel. And the subtitle says, after 50 years of failure to stop violence and terrorism against Palestinians by Jewish ultranationalists, lawlessness has become the law. And I tell you, it does paint a very grim picture of the situation there, which is being supported by Israel's allies. Our Anglo-American allies, the very same. And this, I just want to read the summary before you talk a bit more about some of those details. This is the New York Times' summary. It says the first part documents the unequal system of justice that grew around Jewish settlements in Gaza and the West Bank. The second part shows how extremists targeted not only Palestinians but also Israeli officials trying to make peace. The third explores how this movement gained control of the state itself. Taken together, they tell the story of how a radical ideology moved from the fringes to the heart of Israeli political power. Now, of course, you did a very important interview on that very topic and the origins of it, an interview with Michelle Steinberg, the author of a dossier that we've been circulating, which exposes the Temple Mount plot of religious fanatics to go in, blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and rebuild Solomon's Temple to literally bring on Armageddon.
Yeah, and so Michelle was the co-author of the research that was originally published in the year 2000 that we republished in December last year in our dossier. And when I interviewed Michelle, she said in that interview, remember the name Itamar Ben-Gvir, today, tomorrow and forever, something, because she was highlighting this particular Israeli politician as emblematic of everything that we're talking about. And what Now, what our research did that the New York Times doesn't do, and it's its only real weakness, and I don't want to emphasise the weakness part because the fact that the New York Times publishes it all is powerful, but they trace it back to the rise of the post the 6 Day War, and because what happened in the 6 Day War in 1967 was the original borders of Israel that the UN had approved in 1948. Israel was able to take control of all the other areas that had been set aside for the Palestinians, and so they're now called the occupied territories. And they didn't have those before, and now they got them in 1967. And once they got control of them, then instead of the occupation was unlawful anyway, so they occupied them. But instead of occupying lawfully, if that's such a thing, this movement increasingly took over Israel, where they completely broke international law by encouraging Jewish settlements in these occupied areas that displaced the Palestinians living in there. And there was another version on a slower burn, if you will, of what was called the Nakba in 1948, which the areas that are called the proper areas of Israel, they cleared out 700,000 Palestinians in 1948 from these areas, right? It's called the Nakba, or the catastrophe. So they started doing the same thing. They're moving these militant, messianic Jewish settlers into them. And by messianic, that means that these are people who believe that this is that God has given them this land. They have total, absolute ownership of it, that the Palestinians who've lived there unbroken for 2,000 years, that doesn't matter, this is their land. And they have to occupy this land because they have this goal to rebuild the temple to bring back the Messiah, so the Messiah can come and redeem the Jews, right? Now that's according to their book and their interpretation of their book. The whole world has to live according to their interpretation of their book. And of course you can't do international politics this way, right? Or else then the Palestinians go, well, here's our interpretation of our book, right? And you have a religious war. And that's why the original research that Michelle Steinberg co-authored was who's sparking a religious war in the Middle East. So we provided all that background, which actually is where these movements came from. And we took it back to the 19th century, and actually it was British imperial divide and conquer strategy that did it. That the whole legacy of British Empire is what we're dealing with in Palestine today. But that said, without that background, the rest was really excellent. And they highlight how this actual terrorist led by this Rabbi Meir Kahane and his Kark party, and the Israeli state called them terrorists. They were outlawed. And so this group that was outlawed in the 70s has, even though they're outlawed, continued to grow and expand because the Israeli state, and there was a lot of confession in this article by people from the Shin Bet as well, the domestic security agency, they said themselves, when we saw Jewish terrorists, we'd treat them with kid gloves, whereas any sign of resistance from the Palestinians was just crushed, absolutely crushed. And it's like the thing with the hostages as an example, right? Oh, Hamas took 240 hostages on that day. Yeah, because in Hamas's mind, the 7,000 Israelis the 7,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisoners without charge, a lot of them kids, they see them as hostages. So they have these extraordinary powers. They can just lock up masses of people without charge, right? If you throw a stone, if you're a teenager throwing a stone against a soldier who has an M16, you're the terrorist. That's a terrorist. They're so heavy-handed. And so this feature goes through, well, the cumulative effect of this repression of the Palestinians, but at the same time by security forces that were allowing actual terrorists off the hook, allowed that terrorist element, that messianic extremist element to flourish and grow and grow and grow to the point where in 1995, that group assassinated the Prime Minister of Israel who was trying to bring about peace, Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin had denounced this group in Parliament. He called them an errant weed. He said, you are not part of our country at all, right? He just completely denounced them. Well, they killed him. And then it kept flourishing because Benjamin Netanyahu, basically, who's not one of them, but has courted them his whole life to the point where in 2022, Netanyahu faced the reality that he's got charges hanging over his head that are going to send him to prison unless he could form, that had election, unless he could form government. And for the first time ever, while these extremists have always existed in the Israeli Knesset as a small fringe, for the first time ever, in order to make sure he could become a prime minister again and not go to prison, he formed a coalition with them. And they include these two characters, Itamar Ben-Gvir that Michelle talked about, and Bezalel Smotrich, he's the finance minister. He made Ben-Gvir the national security minister. The New York Times feature goes through in great detail how Ben-Gvir is implicated in the assassination of Rabin, because a couple of weeks before Rabin was assassinated, as a younger man, Ben-Gvir had got close to his car, as his motorcade as it's going through, and he bragged on television later on. He said, I got close to the motorcade, next time we're going to get him. 2 weeks later or something like that, Rabin is assassinated, right? That man is now the National Security Minister of the State of Israel. And so the New York Times has opened all this up to say this is the backdrop to what we're dealing with in Gaza, right? And look, and it's not, the whole red herring of, oh, do you condemn Hamas, do you justify, it's not about condemning Hamas or justifying October 7. You can be horrified by all aspects of this. But when the narrative that was deliberately run by the Israelis and the Americans and the British, etc., try to make it sound totally ahistoric, that history didn't start until the 7th of October, to deny all this, to deny the things that this repression that cumulatively builds up, so that when something snaps, it's like, if I can compare it to a crime of passion, right, which is usually between people who have some kind of relationship. But when one of them murders the other, the murder is usually really brutal, because there's so much feeling comes out. And that's why it's called a crime of passion. I mean, that's just, I'm no expert, right? I'm just giving you that analogy. The horrific stuff that happened, put aside what's been exaggerated, and I think viewers who are familiar with the subject would know that, the horrific stuff that's happened has an explanation. And it wasn't because a bunch of Muslims in Gaza woke up on the 7th of October, read the Quran and said, we're going to kill Jews. That is not what happened, right? The New York Times has shone a light on what's actually happened. So we're asking, is the New York Times now anti-Semitic too? Because the ICC, International Criminal Court, has just indicted two Hamas guys and 2 Israeli government leaders, right? And Peter Dutton, 2 days ago, said the International Criminal Court is anti-Semitic. The Israeli apologists around the world, in Australia and in America and Britain, are saying this is outrageous, this is anti-Semitism, by wanting to provide some kind of a justice here. So, Elisa, there is some, for those who understand the significance of this, I think, and they'd be aware of the debate in Australia, which is quite weak. Our government has done some positive things by supporting Palestine's right to be a member of the UN, etc., but it fluctuates. And there's an enormous media, most of the media machine is very much on the side of Israel here, especially the Murdoch crowd. So don't take it from the Citizens Party, or don't take it from of Palestinians, but understand the power of this New York Times thing. So what I would encourage people to do is get a copy of this to your local member of parliament. Now, you can email us and we will send you a PDF, because the actual thing, if you got a subscription to the New York Times, or ask them if they do, they can find it on the website. Otherwise, we can send you a PDF copy of it, right? Get it to your local member of parliament. Say, look, you need to read what the New York Times, the context New York Times has provided on this question. Let's get this to every member of parliament in Australia, right? And actually get a reality check into this debate, which is otherwise completely ridiculous. That young woman, Fatima Payman, broke with her youngest member of parliament, youngest member of the Labor Party.
Yeah.
You know, bless her, she broke with she defied her own leader last week to say enough's enough, right? But she's not the only one. and I've got to tell this one story before we wrap up. There was a press conference last week with the Greens, and everyone knows the Greens' position on Palestine. And we're not the Greens, we're a different party, but when it comes to this sort of stuff, it's about humanity. The Greens did a press conference. Maria van Vakenu, a Labor Member of Parliament, stood with them. So did Mark Colton, a National Party member for Parks. He's the only one on the Conservative side who is characterised as pro-Palestinian. The reason he is, he's explained, he was offered one of these paid trips to Israel that organisations like the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs do to all members of Parliament. They pay for them to go to Israel and give them their version of events in Israel. He was unhappy. He was uncomfortable with accepting a paid trip to Israel by this lobby group. So he paid his own way, and he got to spend time in the West Bank. And a total duck out of, like, it amazes me that here's this Conservative Member of Parliament who, because he had this different experience, because he didn't take the paid trip, he has a totally different perspective on what's happening over there as well. More people need that balance. The New York Times feature will help to do that. So if you want to help get this to members of Parliament, send us an email at the Citizens Party, info@citizensparty.org.au, requesting it, and we will get you the PDF and you can forward it to your Member of Parliament.
So, I mean, these are all really excellent examples, including those people you mentioned, the New York Times, that the horror of war we're sleepwalking into.
Yeah.
You know, people are beginning to wake up to that. And also the reality that putting the truth out has a very real impact. It changes history. So
I'm sure there's big tectonic reasons why the New York Times has done this, right? Because you never see this in American mainstream media, let alone the New York Times, right? So who knows where this is going, but it's quite useful. Yeah,
so we'll find out more as time goes on, no doubt. But in the meantime, for more background on all those stories, get in contact with us to get a copy of the alert service. You can subscribe online as well. That's all that we've got time for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for tuning in, and see you again next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.